Just before going out and picking up the season opening win on opening day over the Angels on Thursday, the Orioles finally set their 26-man opening day roster. So let's break it down. Who made it? Who didn't? What their roles will be. Coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Friday, March 29th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are going to break down the Orioles' 2024 opening day roster, as it was announced shortly before their opening day victory over the Angels on Thursday. Going to go through the hitters, how these lineups could look against lefties and righties, and what role the guys will play off the bench. We'll go through the pitchers and take a look at how the Orioles could use their bullpen, I should say. And then finally, look at, what roster moves could be made, and then we'll briefly preview the rest of this weekend series to open the year between the Orioles and the Angels. So let's start with that opening day roster. The Orioles were actually one of the last teams, I believe, on Thursday, kind of late morning, to announce their roster. Brandon Hyde, when he was speaking to the media on Thursday morning, said they were still working out a few things, and those things turned out to be Jacob Webb going on the paternity list kind of at the last minute, and we'll get to that, which switch things up a little bit, but we will begin with the hitters who made this opening day roster for the Orioles. And once they made the signing of Tony Kemp on Tuesday, bringing in the veteran utility man on a 1-year, $1 million guaranteed major league contract, we pretty much knew who the 13 hitters were going to be. Of course, Adley Rutschman and James McCann were the two catchers to make the roster. And we know Adley is going to play a lot of games. He played 154 of 162 last season. I would expect around 150 games again for Adley this season. He'll DH a good amount even when he's not catching. Generally, you'll see James McCann catching on Sundays, the day game after a night game. They'll try to get McCann in there maybe against some left-handed pitching to give Adley a day off or give him a DH day, but it's going to be a lot of Adley behind the plate and then McCann in there. They also announced that Michael Perez is the third catcher. Now, he's not on the active roster, but he will be with the Orioles on the taxi squad probably for most of the season, where you can kind of carry a third catcher in case somebody gets hurt. You can just slip another one onto the roster. That's why Perez also came down the orange carpet on Thursday. Been around the bigs with the Pirates and the Mets and others. Always been either a second or third catcher for a big league team, but he would be the next guy that they go to. Then in the infield, the Orioles carrying 7 infielders to begin the season. Gunnar Henderson, Tony Kemp, Jorge Mateo, Ryan Mountcastle, Ryan O'Hearn, Ramon Arias, and Jordan Westberg are those 7 infielders. In terms of the guys who are going to be in there every day, it's going to be Gunnar Henderson. And for him, it was really interesting because Brandon Hyde had said kind of late in spring training, hey, Gunnar Henderson is our shortstop this year. And it made me think, okay, he'll probably play more short and less third than he did last year. But the fact that the Orioles got Jorge Mateo into the lineup on Thursday against a left-handed starter, and not only was Gunnar playing short, but he was still leading off against a lefty. Gunnar has somewhat struggled in his young big league career against left-handed pitching. And generally last year, the Orioles would hit Gunnar lead off against righties, but that would move him down to 4th in the order against lefties. Now, that's still a pretty good spot in your lineup, but his on base would go significantly down against lefties, so didn't want him to lead off. But a good sign that the O's put him up there on Thursday, and he drew a 4-pitch walk in the game. He had a single in the game as well. Also did strike out against a lefty, but those are good signs. And what Thursday's lineup tells me is that Gunnar is pretty much the everyday shortstop. I mean, he will still play a little bit of third base. He'll DH a little. He'll get a few off days here and there, probably against lefties. But when he's in there, 90+% of the time, Gunnar is probably going to be the shortstop for this team. What that means for the other infielders, well, for Jorge Mateo, it means he's going to play more second base. And that is where he started in the lineup, hitting 9th, playing second against the left-handed starter on Thursday on opening day. It's something I talked about. Listen, I know Jorge Mateo after May 1st was literally the worst qualified hitter in baseball last season. But even with all of that, most of the nightmare at-bats came against righties. He still had a 108 WRC plus against left-handed pitching last year. That is 8% better than league average at the plate against lefties. And he got the start. He had a double, stole a base, drew a walk. And that looked pretty good. Now, Mateo had a couple of plays at second base. It's a position he played before, played a little bit with the Padres, played second a little bit when he first came over to the Orioles via waivers in 2021. But he made a bad throw and a double play chance that allowed 2 runs to score in the 8th. And also in the 8th inning, didn't pick out a throw from Austin Hayes, which would have been a nice put out at second base. Instead, dropped it, turned into a leadoff double in that 8th inning. So really didn't help out Dylan Tate when the Angels scored 2 in the 8th, but made the routine plays as well, which is good to see. And Mateo is such a great defensive shortstop that it should fully translate to second base as well. But he's also going to play the outfield. I wouldn't be surprised if Mateo gets some time at all 3 outfield positions this season. It's something he worked on a lot this offseason, something he worked on a lot in spring training. He will be in the lineup against lefties. He will not start against righties. I would be surprised if Mateo gets a start against as long as the team stays healthy, if he gets a start against more than 5 games where a righty is starting for the other team. Like, he will rarely start then. When it's a righty on the hill, he's your pinch running weapon off the bench. When it's a lefty, he'll probably start in the outfield or at second base. Now, speaking of those lefty and righty splits, that takes us to Ryan Mountcastle, who is obviously going to hit higher in the order against lefties. He crushes left-handers, but it will be interesting to see how he's used against righties, because when the O's face a righty, which they will on Saturday, Griffin Canning getting the start in game 2, you have a lot more left-handed hitters you want to get into the lineup, and it's going to be a little tougher to get them all in. So it will be interesting. I would think Mountcastle still plays most of the time against righties, but when he does get days off, it will certainly be against right-handed pitching. And the other first baseman in there is Ryan O'Hearn, who did not get the start on opening day against a lefty. Now, he did pinch hit later in the game against a righty and had a double. So ho-hum, here goes Ryan O'Hearn again. But a big reason for O'Hearn's success when he came over the O's last year from the Royals, was so bad with Kansas City, just turned it around in Baltimore last year, is that the O's just hid him from lefties. O'Hearn, despite playing most of the season, only had 29 plate appearances against left-handed pitching last year. The O's hid him from those lefties. They said, don't worry about lefties. I think that helped him have more success in general. And I think they're going to do the same thing this season. Now, it doesn't mean he won't face lefties at all. And I honestly think he'll probably get more than those 29 plate appearances against lefties this year. But it's something to monitor. He's going to be in there either at DH, first base, maybe a little corner outfield against righties. But against lefties, don't expect him in the order. Now, someone who's definitely going to be in the order against lefties is Jordan Westburg, who DH'd in the lineup against the lefty, hitting 6th on Thursday. And I honestly think for Westburg, he's going to be in the lineup most days. Now, I'm not ready to call him an everyday player. Like, I don't think you can pencil in, 150 plus games for Jordan Westburg just yet. But even when he doesn't start, he'll have a chance to be a defensive replacement or pinch hit. He's going to play a lot of games for the Orioles this year. He'll DH some, he'll play third base, he'll play second base. And I think against a lot of righties he'll play. Against every lefty he'll certainly play. But even against righties, I think the O's are going to get him into this lineup as well, which leaves us really the final 2 guys on the Orioles bench in terms of position players in the infield. That is Ramon Arias and Tony Kemp. Now, the big question, once it became clear that Tony Kemp, after being signed, was going to get that final roster spot, the big question was, okay, who is going to DH on opening day and DH against left-handers for the Orioles early in the season? We had thought at one point, before the O's signed Tony Kemp, that Tyler Nevin was going to get that final roster spot. Ended up not being the case. But when we thought that, Nevin seemed like the easy choice, because he's been much better against lefties, to just DH against lefties if he's on this team. Then they brought in Kemp, who is a left-handed hitter and does hit okay against left-handers, but light hitting Tony Kemp as your opening day DH, kind of a bad look. So it was actually Ramon Arias who got the call. Now, technically, he didn't DH. The Orioles started him at third and had Westburg DH with Mateo at second, but those guys will rotate around those positions, third, DH, and second against the lefties early in the season. But it was interesting to see, because Ramon Arias, both last year and over his career, has been a reverse splits guy. What that means is, despite being a right-handed hitter, he has been much, much better against right-handed pitching and has really struggled against left-handed pitching in his career. But I guess just because, hey, he is a right-hander against the lefty, you get him in there. Now, he was the only Orioles starter without a hit on Thursday on opening day. Did draw a walk, so reached base one time. But just something to monitor if Arias does stay in there as that kind of extra hitter against lefties, or if Kemp gets a chance, maybe O'Hearn gets a chance, one of the outfielders gets a chance. But in terms of Tony Kemp, to me, he just feels like the placeholder on this team until Jackson Holliday gets to the big leagues, or until maybe the Orioles trade Ramon Arias, then maybe Kemp could stick around when Holiday gets here. But then once Mayo gets here, Kemp's going to be gone. I can't imagine Tony Kemp survives this entire season on the Orioles roster, and he doesn't have options. If you get rid of him, you have to DFA him. You can't just send him to AAA. It's interesting that the O's did give him a big league contract, but he's going to start here and there against some lefties, against some righties. He'll play some second. He'll play some left field. But I think he's going to be mostly a super bench player and not really see him a whole lot in the lineup. Then we move to the outfield, where the O's have four of them: Austin Hayes, Cedric Mullins, Anthony Santander, and Colton Cowser. Now, we saw three of the four in the starting lineup on Thursday, and that's what we're going to see against lefties this year. Cedric Mullins will still play center field. Austin Hayes will be in left, and Anthony Santander will either be in right field or possibly could be DHing if they move the outfield around a little bit. Now, Santander is going to play every day, and quite honestly, Cedric Mullins will probably get some off days against lefties here and there, but most likely he's going to play almost every day in center field. Santander, right field, DH, little first base maybe as well, but he'll be in there every day in the middle of the order. The question is Austin Hayes and Colton Cowser. Now, the Orioles are certainly going to hide Cowser from lefties early in the season. It's something he struggled against. He's younger. They're going to ease him in against left-handed pitching. So he came into the game as a defensive replacement late on opening day, but did not have a plate appearance. What will be interesting between these two is, okay, against lefties, no doubt, Hayes in the lineup, Cowser on the bench. But against righties, again, like the O's will see on Saturday, I am intrigued to see what they do because I don't really know what they're going to do. They're going to play Hayes more than Cowser overall early in this season to kind of ease Cowser in. Hayes has been the guy here for a while, but Cowser just has a higher ceiling as a hitter than Hayes does, and especially against right-handed pitching. So I'm really intrigued there, but they will find ways to get Cowser semi-regularly into this order. So with those guys making the team, the guys who were kind of in limbo but did not were, of course, Nick Maton, who was DFA'd when Kemp was signed, Tyler Nevin, who we thought had a spot before Tony Kemp, he was DFA'd, and then Ryan McKenna, somewhat surprisingly because he's hung on for a while, was also designated for assignment on Thursday. Now, my opinion on those guys, I think Nick Maton will probably clear waivers. He was terrible in spring. He hasn't been a great player as of late, so I think the O's will keep him in AAA. I think Tyler Nevin will actually get claimed. I think the O's will lose Nevin again. The bat looked really good in spring. I think a team will take a chance on him. And then I think the O's are going to keep Ryan McKenna. McKenna, just the bat has just gone so far down that, yeah, he can run and he can play good defense at all three outfield positions. But that player profile, every team has that in their organization. You can honestly just grab your AAA center fielder to do that if you need it. So at this point in his career, like, it's not really worth for another team this early in the season devoting a 40-man roster spot to Ryan McKenna to claim him on waivers. That's why I think he's actually going to clear waivers and will stay in AAA Norfolk as depth for the Orioles. And I think there's still a chance McKenna plays for the O's at some point this year just because he's a known quantity. And if the O's need an outfielder for 5 days, they would just as easily, call up McKenna because they know what he would bring them. But those are the 13 pitchers that the Orioles have on their opening day roster. Of course, now we watch, when does Kjerstad get the call back up? When do Holiday and Mayo get here? Does Stowers get a chance? Does Norby get a chance? Those are the things we will continue to monitor early in this season. But next up, we will move to the pitching side, where we actually had one surprise on the opening day roster, and I'll talk about it coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Now, you can say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a 1 seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. And I've been picking Tennessee, and I'm sticking with the Volunteers on the men's side. And although LSU on the women's side has looked a little shaky, I'm still sticking with the Tigers over there, supporting the players and not their head coach. So just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. So as we roll through the Orioles opening day roster here, we move things over to the pitching side. On the hitting side, I ended up going 12 for 13 on my final roster prediction. It's just because the Orioles signed Tony Kemp to be on the roster. I picked Jackson Holliday. They sent him down to AAA. On the pitching side, I also went 12 for 13. So in total, 24 out of 26. But the reason I got one wrong on the pitching side is a little different, and I'll get to that in a moment. But we'll begin with the starting rotation, which was announced a weeks ago by Brandon Hyde. Of course, Corbin Burns, opening day starter, was tremendous, unbelievable, amazing to watch on opening day on Thursday. Number 2 will be Grayson Rodriguez. He'll go on Saturday. Tyler Wells, the number 3 starter, will go Sunday. And then Monday against the Royals, Dean Kramer at number 4. And then Tuesday against the Royals is Cole Irvin, who will be the number 5 starter to begin the year. We will see how things play out here on the pitching side for the Orioles. We've gotten some updates about Kyle Bradish and John Means, both pushed back to different levels. I think what the good thing was for both of them is the Orioles, of course, had to make the injured list moves for both of them before the game Thursday, and both were placed on the 15-day IL. Now, that does not mean they'll be back after 15 days. It'll probably be longer for both of them. But John Means, we had heard, is about a month behind. Orioles announced on Tuesday that Means would, pretty early in the Norfolk Tide season, which starts, I believe, later this week or early next week, Means will make a couple of rehab starts in AAA. So I'm thinking that, by May 1st, it feels like John Means will be ready to return to the Orioles. It'll basically just be, among probably Wells and Kramer, whoever's pitching worse will move to the bullpen, you would think, and give John Means a starting rotation spot. I'm still a little worried about how they're handling him, but it seems like if he's going on rehab this soon, he'll be good to go. Just was a little behind because of the setback he had with the elbow in the postseason last year after returning last September from Tommy John surgery. And then there is Kyle Bradish, who was also placed on the 15-day injured list. And that is actually pretty positive news, because if the Orioles knew for sure that even if Bradish was going to come back this year and he wasn't getting Tommy John and he wasn't going to miss the whole season, if they felt that, okay, he's going to miss a significant amount of time, they could have just placed him on the 60-day injured list. Now, you have to stay out for 60 days or more if you do that. But if you place a player on the 60-day IL, you open up a 40-man roster spot, which gives you more roster flexibility. And then once the player is activated, they go back on the 40-man. So the O's did have a little flexibility anyway, because with the Nevin DFA and the McKenna DFA, the Orioles roster already sat at just 38 players on the 40-man. So they already had 2 open spots. So they didn't absolutely need to clear Bradish's spot too to get the 3rd open spot. Maybe they will at some point. But it is good news that the Orioles didn't just automatically put Bradish on the 60-day injured list. Now, I doubt he comes back in sooner than 60 days. I do highly doubt that. He's barely throwing bullpens. They're not even close to talking about ramping him up and getting him on rehab starts and whatever it may be. But Mike Elias did say last week that he expects both Means and Bradish to be back in the early part of the first half. Now, I don't know exactly what that means. I would pretty much guarantee Means will be certainly back out there before Bradish is, but it seems like the bullpens are going well. The PRP, the rehab, going well so far for Bradish, trying to avoid Tommy John surgery with that elbow sprain, the slight tear in the UCL that he suffered back in January. Seems like things are progressing well. We'll see. That's really the best update we have right now, is that they're hoping to have him back in the early part of the first half. And not being on the 60-day IL, I think, is a good step for Bradish. When he were to return, then you're really looking at, either Wells or Kramer or Irvin. The worst 2 out of those 3 probably go to the bullpen if you get Bradish and Means back in that rotation at some point. But then you move into the bullpen for the Orioles. And this is where I got 7 out of 8 in my projection. Craig Kimbrell made the team. He is certainly going to be the closer for this Orioles team. He is a Hall of Fame closer. He's going to get the 9th inning to begin things off. Of course, didn't pitch on Thursday because the Orioles won 11-3. Then your kind of top high leverage guys. Yennier Cano is back after an amazing 2023 season. He'll get some high leverage spots. Danny Coulombe back in there after a great season last year as well. And CNL Perez had a little bit of a shaky spring, but he was awesome for the Orioles down the stretch last year. He'll get in there in some key moments as well. And then you got some middle relievers who, we'll kind of see what their role turns into. Dylan Tate, after missing all of last year, returned to the mound in the 8th inning on Thursday on opening day. Looked a little shaky, gave up 2 runs. 1 was unearned, walked a batter. The movement was good. The velocity was way down, but okay, all in all, we'll continue to monitor him. Mike Baumann also makes this team. He was the first reliever out of the pen pitched the 7th inning with the Orioles up 8-1, I believe, at that point. He did walk the leadoff batter. The command was shaky, but he was able to roll a double play and put up a 0 in the 7th. And he looked closer to the shaky Mike Baumann that we saw in the second half last year, not the dominant Mike Baumann we saw in spring training this season. But again, we'll continue to monitor him. He'll be kind of in that middle reliever role, maybe a swing guy to do 2 innings at this point. Keegan Aiken also made this team. As highly as Brandon Hyde was talking about him in spring training, you kind of knew at that point he was going to make the team, even though he did have options remaining. Aiken, who missed basically the entire second half of last season with a back injury, was even pitching through that back injury earlier in the year when he struggled. Hyde has been really impressed with how his stuff has just looked at this point, and Aiken did come into the game in the 9th inning, and he threw a 1-2-3 ninth with 2 strikeouts to close out the Orioles' 11-3 win on opening day. Struck out Aaron Hicks and Taylor Ward and got Mickey Moniak to hit a soft ground ball. So yeah, it was 11-3 in the 9th inning, so about as low a leverage a spot as you can get there for Keegan Aiken, but I thought the stuff looked good in his first appearance of the year coming back from that injury. The fastball was the Keegan Aiken fastball. I mean, it was 93-95. He got 4 swings and misses on 6 swings on that pitch. It just has that deception that fastball does, kind of, almost feels like it's rising on hitters. His release point, which is a little bit lower on the left side, allows it to play along with that induced vertical break that he has, which makes that fastball good. Hopefully he can continue what he did with that pitch on Thursday. But again, he'll be like the middle relief option if the Orioles need to bridge something. A starter comes out in the 3rd inning, they need to get it to the 5th or 6th. Aiken might be a guy they call on as well. But the final guy to make this bullpen was the one surprise, and that was Nick Vespi, who just about a week and a half ago was optioned down to minor league camp, which basically told us Vespi has options left. He's not going to make the team. He'll begin the year in AAA. Now, when that move was made, I said Vespi is almost certainly going to pitch for the Orioles in 2024. He's going to be that up-down guy that he's been really for the last 2 seasons for the O's. But when he made the roster, I was surprised because it was like, you already optioned him. He wasn't left in big league camp. Why did he make the team? Well, then we found out the guy who was going to make the team, Jacob Webb, who I had predicted because he's out of options, even though he'd struggled at the end of last year and struggled in spring training, he'd get that final bullpen spot. Well, Jacob Webb is heading to the paternity list. So congrats to Jacob Webb and his family. But it makes you think, okay, that buys the Orioles a couple more days to make a decision on a bullpen spot, which is certainly nice to have. Usually guys, I'd say the average is like 2 to 3 days you spend on the paternity list. So either Sunday or Monday, I would maybe expect Jacob Webb to be reactivated. Now, most likely Nick Vespi, if there's another blowout game, I could see the Orioles using him this weekend. But once we get to Sunday or Monday, the thought would be, okay, Webb comes back. The Orioles put him on the roster. They option Vespi back to AAA, and they go with what they would have gone with on opening day had Webb not gone on the paternity list. But what this also does is it gives the Orioles a little more time to make an upgrade. Something I talked about on the podcast this week is that I was feeling a little shaky about Webb and Aiken at the back of the bullpen, and I said, I think the O's will make a Danny Coulomb style move for this bullpen. What that means is, remember, Coulomb, who was put on waivers by the Twins right before opening day last year, the Orioles picked him up a day before opening day and put him on the opening day roster as the final reliever. I thought they might do it again because it felt like Webb was a little bit of a shaky option at the end of the pen. Obviously, they did not find the right fit, or they just weren't awarded any players on waivers because the O's are so low on the waiver wire. But it gives the O's, with Webb out there, a few more days to make one of these moves. Because if the Orioles, let's say on Saturday, find somebody out there like a Johan Ramirez or a Sean Reed Foley or a Phil Bickford, just some names I've been kind of interested in that could be available on waivers or via free agency. If they are able to pick up one of those guys, what they can do is, because Vespi's here and has options, they can just put that guy on the roster, option Vespi down to AAA, and then once Webb comes back, you basically make a decision between Jacob Webb or the guy you picked up. And it is totally possible that the Orioles could just DFA Webb when he returns from the paternity list. It's kind of a tough scene for him, but if the Orioles are able to, in the next couple of days, find a better pitcher than Webb on waivers, they will do it. They will add him to the roster, and Webb will find himself on waivers, but we'll certainly kind of keep our eye on that to see if the O's can find really this year's version of Danny Coulomb. But that's a look at the 26-man roster and how those guys will be used. Next up, to finish off the pod, just want to take a look forward. Final 2 games of this season opening series between the Orioles and the Angels. So we'll finish off the pod here, just taking a look forward this weekend. Of course, Orioles are off today. Generally, after you play opening day, you get the next day off just in case it rains and you have to move the game. You still have an opening for opening day. And the O's almost had to do that. The weather did not look great Thursday, but luckily the rain held off and they were able to, not the greatest weather, rainy 50s, but they played a baseball game and that was nice to see. Day off Friday, then the Orioles back in action on Saturday. New thing for this season, pretty much every Saturday home game is a 4 o'clock start, and that begins on Saturday, a 4:05 p.m. Eastern time first pitch. Grayson Rodriguez coming off an incredible second half last year in his rookie season, and then a pretty tough playoff start against the Rangers. Will get the ball as the number 2 starter. He did struggle in his start against the Angels last year. Now, it's mostly because it was the old Grayson early in the year, and it was also because they had Shohei Ohtani who roughed him up. But he will go up against Griffin Canning in this start, the right-hander who gets the number 2 start for the Angels. Canning, a 27-year-old right-hander for LA, who's kind of been like a sleeper breakout pick for people for the last couple of years. Debuted in 2019 and has been mostly in the Angels rotation since then. Last year, he made 22 starts through a career-high 127 innings and posted a 4.32 ERA. Pretty good strikeout numbers to walk numbers as well. People do like Griffin Canning. He's got some interesting stuff as well. It'll be definitely interesting to see what the Orioles do with the lineup. If someone like Mountcastle or Hayes sits to get Colton Cowser into the order, that would probably have to happen to get Cowser in there for his first start of the year. So we will see what they do. But it's a kind of a fastball slider changeup mix for Canning, although he mixes his pitches pretty well with the curveball. The fastball is at 35% of the time. He throws it, 94, 95, 96. Has a pretty good whiff rate, pretty good spin rate. It's a really solid fastball. His slider seems to be his strikeout pitch at times, throws it about 30% of the time, has a 34% whiff rate on that pitch. Then he's got a changeup that he likes to use against left-handers and a pretty solid curveball to go with it as well. That is the 4-pitch mix for Griffin Canning, and throws everything pretty hard. Fastball 95, changeup at 90, slider at 88. So it's not a lot of super soft stuff from the right-hander. And then we move things on to Sunday, where hopefully that day the Orioles are going for the sweep, a 1:35 p.m. Eastern time start. Tyler Wells, who gets the spot as the number 3 starter for the O's, of course, had the amazing first half last year. Then the body kind of gave out on him, went to the minors, came back as a really good reliever late in the season, closed out the clinching game in late September, kind of became, it seemed like, the closer right at the end of the year with Felix Bautista out. But he is back in the rotation to begin the year to take on another lefty for the Angels in Reed Detmers, who is going to start on Sunday. I would expect a very similar lineup to opening day for the Orioles against another lefty on Sunday. Reed Detmers, who has thrown a no-hitter in his career, has had a super up and down time. He was great in 2022. Last year, 28 starts, about 150 innings, had a 4.48 ERA, really good strikeout numbers. Also had some, let's say, issues with walks last year for Reed Detmers. So certainly something to take a look at. Not anything crazy at all, but just at times the command would get away from him a little bit. But the strikeout rate is really, really good for Detmers, and he is a big-time slider guy. Now, he's got a fastball at 94. He throws about 40% of the time, but his slider, he throws 31% of the time, relies on that pitch a lot. It's his strikeout pitch. He'll throw it to righties and lefties, not afraid to use it in any count, really. After that, he's got a curveball and a changeup that he'll use to try and get right-handed batters out as well. And the curveball was pretty good last year. So the Orioles have faced Detmers a couple times as well, and we'll see what they can do against him. And then that'll be it for series number 1 on the year. And I'll be back on Monday to recap the series, really recap the final 2 games on Saturday and Sunday. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles podcast on YouTube. Give us a 5-star rating and a review wherever you listen, and join us back here on Monday for the first weekend recap episode of the Orioles 2024 season. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.